Hello everybody, welcome back. In this next series of videos we're going to be looking at economic growth, and so continuing on from our last few videos about gross domestic product or GDP, we're continuing with that idea using real GDP per capita to look at economic growth over time. And so what we're going to do in this series of videos, first look at how we measure economic growth, talk about what's required for economic growth, why some countries grow faster, some countries go slower, and then look at some concepts related to productivity, convergence, and something called the middle income trap. So these are the big questions that we're going to be talking about. In the last video, we saw this graph, and we're going to continue with this idea by measuring economic growth using real GDP per capita. So per capita meaning per person, and real meaning that we're adjusting for inflation so that all of the GDP numbers in a time series like we see in this graph are comparable over time. So again, back in the 50s, we were down around 15,000 US dollars per year as the real GDP per capita. Essentially, you can again think of that as basically average incomes in the country. Here in the 70s, we're at about 25K. 25K. And up here now, we're closer to about 60K GDP per capita per year. So since the 1950s, it's more than doubled. Actually, it's about quadrupled. Even in the last 50 years, since the 70s, GDP per capita has more than doubled. So we do see this growth over time. That's essentially like taking the standard of living today, about 60,000. Consider if you were living in today's world making $15,000 or $25,000 per year. That's the equivalent standard of living that we would have seen 50 or 75 years ago. So the United States has seen a lot of this growth. A lot of other countries have seen growth, but many countries haven't grown much at all. And so we're going to explore why that happens. But I also want to tell you to think about when we have this more than doubling of GDP over time, we can actually use a mathematical trick to think about how long it would take other countries to grow over time given their growth rates, which, by the way, the United States has grown at about 2% a year, plus or minus depending on the time frame if we're looking at kind of long-term time horizons. So different countries have different economic growth rates, and based on that, we can use a little mathematical trick, rule of thumb, called the rule of 72, to think about how quickly a country's standard of living will double. This rule of 72, it works for anything. It's just a general rule. You take a growth rate and you take 72 divided by that number. Let me put this over here. 72 divided by the growth rate, and you do this as a whole number. We'll do some examples here. But if it was a 2% growth rate, you would use 2, not 0.02. So in any case, let's look at some examples here. Like I said, the United States has been growing at about 2% a year in the long run. China and a lot of other less developed countries tend to grow faster. This is an idea of convergence that we'll talk about in a future video. But in these 25 years between 1975 and 2000, Chinese income per capita grew at about 6% per year. So given a growth rate of 6%, how long would it take for the income per capita to double in China? All we do is take 72. If they're growing at 6% a year, we throw a 6 in the denominator. So that means Chinese incomes, if they maintain that that growth rate, Chinese incomes will will double every 12 years. Yeah, and so this works for economic growth rates in countries, but even in personal finance context, this can work as well. If you are earning 10% interest on an investment every year, how long will it take to double your money? 72 divided by 10 means you're going to double your money in 7.2 years. So if you can maintain that 10% growth rate over 10 years, which would be or over 7.2 years, then you'd be doubling whatever money you started with. So hard to find investments that'll consistently return that, but if you did, you double your money every 7.2 years. And then finally, in the U.S., as I mentioned, a long-run growth rate of about, and we're just going to approximate this with 2%. How often will it take the American GDP to double? 72, always on top, divided by 2, means that American GDP will double every 36 years. And just to quickly go back up to that graph and look at what we saw here, 36 years ago from approximately 2020 is going to be back here in the middle. And so here in about the mid 80s, 36 years ago, 1984 from 2020, we're at about 30,000. And we've grown to about 60,000. So again, it's approximate. We have some ups and downs. It's not a consistent growth rate over time because of the recessions, but we have grown from about 30,000 to about 60,000. And so this rule of 72 is holding up in that graph as well. Okay, in the next video, what we're going to do is dive into looking at measuring economic growth, and then looking at how we think about how countries grow at all, whether they have any growth or no growth, and then if a country is growing, why do some countries grow faster and some countries grow slower? All right, so stay tuned for the next video, and we'll see you there. Thanks.